The ASP.NET navigation controls, as well as the infrastructure behind them, are great examples of the provider model that Microsoft has built into the .NET framework pretty much throughout. As long as you're okay with storing the sitemap as a standard XML file and using the built-in controls, you'll have very little work to implement rich site navigation. But you may have a specialized need for a website, for which the standard model just isn't going to work. That might mean that you have to forego using the built-in controls and build your own from scratch. But the provider model that Microsoft used to architect navigation features lets you create navigation controls that plug into a standard set of framework services using the existing infrastructure. So, for example, if you need to create a new way of storing and modifying the underlying sitemap data while supporting all the existing controls that conform to the standard model, you can do that by plugging in your own provider. It's really a pretty neat system that really makes ASP.NET very flexible to meet your particular needs. There are two important components that enable the site navigation features: the default XML sitemap provider and the sitemap data source. Out of the box, the default navigation provider works with an XML file named web.sitemap that's located in the root of the application. A little bit later in the chapter, you'll learn how you can configure the provider to use other sources if you need to do that. Now, you can create your own navigation provider from inheriting from either the sitemap provider class or the static sitemap provider class, which already has some useful implementations. And you can get more information about creating your own navigation provider in the Visual Studio documentation. The sitemap data source control makes it very easy for you to bind controls such as the menu and tree view control to an XML sitemap file. If you've done any kind of data access within ASP.NET, or in fact any kind of .NET application, you've seen equivalent data source controls for reading SQL databases, for example. This is the same sort of an idea. So it's like other .NET data source controls, except that it's built to work with hierarchical data. That's the biggest difference. Most of the other data source controls in .NET were built to work with relational data. One of the things you have to deal with when working with navigation is absolute and relative URLs. Website navigation is built upon the concept of Uniform Resource Locators, or URLs. All a URL is a way to uniquely identify a resource. Most of the time we're talking about uniquely identifying a web page. So we may go to www.appdev.com/asp.net. I don't know if that's a real web page or folder or whatever, but that is a URL that can uniquely identify a resource. So you see those throughout any kind of application. So you also see these throughout web pages because they're also used in things like href and source attributes of an image or various other kinds of components. So you see these URLs throughout. But the issue is that you can express URLs as either relative or absolute. The difference between the two is whether or not the browser finds the resource in an absolute location, an unambiguous location that is not relative to any other resource. And then the relative, of course, is in a location relative to the current page. The idea is that you don't need to specify an entire absolute URL to uniquely identify a particular location. So let's talk a little bit more about relative URLs. A relative URL is one way to reference a web page. You're specifying the location relative to the current page. So you have a page currently located within the browser. So say that, in fact, you have a default.aspx page in the root directory of your website. From that page, you need to provide a link to the products.aspx page located in the same directory. In that case, you don't need to supply relative path information, and the web server by default looks for the file in the same directory. Now, truth be told, it's actually the browser that is providing the address to the server, but let's keep things simple and just talk about the relative locations of the pages on the web server. So here's how you could construct that URL. So you have an anchor tag with an href attribute that contains the URL. In this case, it's the products.aspx. Because there is no path information on the products.aspx page, we know that it's a relative URL, and specifically that the server should look for this page in the same directory as the page that is currently located. So it makes it very simple. But let's say that on the default page, we also need to include a link to an order form that is in the orders subdirectory. So here's how you can link to that order form. You can now use a relative URL that includes the path and the file name. Notice that the orders subdirectory does not have a slash in front of it. That means that it is relative to the current page. So it's in a subdirectory called orders, which is a subdirectory of the current directory where the default.aspx page is located. And in that subdirectory, the server should be able to find a form called orderform.aspx. Now, of course, if either the orders directory or the orderform.aspx page doesn't exist, then the server is going to throw the infamous 404 page not found error. This is not a way to get around that. Now you can also travel up the directory hierarchy. Say that you have a directory structure shown in the lower right corner of the screen. We have appdev, a subdirectory images, a subdirectory orders. From within the orders subdirectory, we need to reference an image called logo.jpg that is located in the images directory. Just like within Windows, we can use the ... notation to navigate up one level to the appdev directory, / down into the images directory, and reference the logo.jpg that is located within that images directory. This is just another form of the relative URL. So relative URLs are a great way to make a website much more maintainable. The idea is that as long as the locations of pages that reference other pages and resources remain in the same relative locations, links are going to remain valid. You don't need to change links. And if you move them to different locations relative to the root of the website, again, the relative URL is going to remain valid. But now it's a problem if you move files to a different level in the directory structure. For this, you can use root-based relative URLs. In this kind of relative URL, you specify the location of the resource relative to the root of the application. So another way of referencing the logo.jpg file is this way. Now, instead of navigating up the hierarchy, I'm explicitly specifying that the images directory is a subdirectory of the root directory of this application. So it just goes to the root, starts there, looks for the images subdirectory, and grabs the logo.jpg file that's located there. So by starting the relative URL with a /, the site knows to look for the images in that directory that is an immediate child of the root directory. Now, if you move the order form to another subfolder, the link to the image will remain intact even though the relative location of the order form to the image has changed. Another way of specifying URLs is to specify an absolute URL. An absolute URL is a full path including the protocol. It's not just the full path relative to the root, it is the full path including the protocol, which is most commonly HTTP or HTTPS. And then also includes any path information as well as the name of the resource. So, for example, to use the appdev logo that's located in the upper left corner of the website in an image tag on your site, you could use this absolute URL, and this is an actual URL. So you specify the protocol, HTTP, www.appdev.com/images, because it's in that directory, /site, because it's in that subdirectory, /logo_appdevglow.gif. So that's an absolute URL because it's specifying the absolute location of that file. Now you have to use an absolute URL if, like the appdev logo, the resource is located outside of the domain of the current website. So again, if we're including this logo on our default.aspx page on some other domain, then we have to use the absolute URL form. And you also must include the protocol, because if we try to do just www.appdev.com, then it's going to try and look for a subdirectory called www.appdev.com on the current site. Won't find it, you get a 404 error. Now, it may seem that you should always use absolute URLs. After all, they're unambiguous. They ensure that your pages refer to the same resource, even if the referring page moves. And for moving between pages served up with different protocols, such as for SSL pages, you have to use them, because they're changing the protocol. But there are some disadvantages. One problem is that they add to the size of the page sent to the client browser. You're adding a lot of path information, potentially, and all those protocols and domain names add up to bloat, particularly if your web page is complex and references many hundreds of images and pages. Absolute URLs tie the containing pages to the current application, which makes it harder to share pages or even chunks of HTML code between sites, because they all have absolute references, and so you can't move the resources between applications. A similar problem is that it's hard to use a test or a staging server. A very common development scenario is to have a test server where you copy the website over for testing and then you deploy it to a final production server. If you have absolute URLs, every time you move it to a different server, you have to change all of those absolute URLs. Hopefully, a search and replace will work, but you can have various kinds of side effects that may mangle your URLs within the page, so you have to be very careful with that. And they also complicate site maintenance, because every time you move a resource, you have to make sure that you update the URLs of every tag that references the resource, even if the resource hasn't moved. So absolute URLs, just like relative URLs, have a place, but consider very carefully before you use them. Now, one issue with relative URLs is their use in server-side controls. You can use both relative and absolute URLs in server-side controls, both the controls included with ASP.NET as well as any that you create yourself. But often such controls are located in a separate folder. You segregate all of your server-side controls, develop them, and put them in a separate location because they're not really based on location when you use them within a web page. But the problem is that if you use relative paths, they are resolved relative to the path of the control container, such as a page user controller theme that's located in another folder on the site. So this can cause a problem, because the actual path will be relative to the control and not to the container. And master pages complicate things further because paths are resolved relative to the content page. So absolute paths may not be the solution because they're not portable between applications in server-side controls. What you can do within a server-side control is use what's called a web application root operator, which is a tilde, a little squiggle. At runtime, ASP.NET resolves this operator to the root directory of the current application. So it gets rid of all those side effects of having a server-side control that is developed in a different directory from where it's actually used in the container control. So here's how you could use the web application root operator for the image tag to overcome the problem of relative URLs. So use a tilde that represents the root directory of the application, no matter where this image is being referenced in a server controller containing page. So use the tilde /images and /images because the images directory is a child of the root directory in this case, /logo.jpg. So now ASP.NET will do the right thing in resolving the relative URL, even if the page containing the link moves elsewhere in the folder structure. Now, one caution about this. All bets are off if you move the target of the source attribute, the location of the image itself. If you put the logo.jpg in a subdirectory of the images directory, then, well, you have to change the URL, even if it's a relative URL. You just have to change them throughout the website. That's why it's worth taking some time to think through your site structure before creating too many pages and resources. Let's start talking about the navigation features within ASP.NET. Creating an XML sitemap file is the first step in working with site navigation. The sitemap is an XML document that contains a set of nested sitemap node elements that represent both real and virtual pages in the site. And we'll talk a little bit more later in this section about what that means, the difference between real and virtual pages. The sitemap file forms the basis for the structure of the site, as well as how the user navigates it. What's going to happen is that the various controls, the navigation controls that you put on your page, are going to use the sitemap file in order to structure themselves, in order to let the user know how he or she can navigate around the different pages. Now, the sitemap file consists of fairly straightforward XML. It defines the site structure through nested node elements, as I mentioned. Somewhat surprisingly, there's no graphical designer in Visual Studio. It's really a rather odd omission. But fortunately, the XML that you have to write is pretty straightforward and simple. There aren't many attributes, and there's some optional attributes, but it's pretty easy XML to develop. So let's take a look at how the sitemap works and how it looks within Visual Studio. I'll go ahead and open the web.sitemap file in the example navigation website. I'll go ahead and go to full screen mode so we can see a little bit more of it. So this is the XML for a fairly simple website. It starts out with a root sitemap node that doesn't itself have any interesting attributes, but is the container for all of the sitemap node elements that are nested within its content. Every child is of a single type called sitemap node, and you can nest them to any depth that you want in order to fully define the structure of the website. We'll talk about some of the features, but one thing that I wanted to point out here is that we also have, besides the standard attributes, we have custom attributes. In this navigation example, we'll show how you can use that from within this file in order to customize the appearance of the page based on the location within the navigation hierarchy. A couple things to note about this sitemap. As I mentioned, we have the root sitemap, and this is what actually becomes the home page or the root sitemap node. This is going to be the main top-level navigation item. You can have multiple sitemap nodes at this level, in which case all of the navigation controls will always display multiple locations. In this particular case, if I collapse that, we see that we only have a single root sitemap node, which means that we're only going to have a single top-level node in the navigation controls, which happens to be called home. But that's not a limitation of the sitemap file. So we have the root home navigation node, and then within that we have a tame animals and a wild animals child node. And then we have various other child nodes below that. And again, you can nest that as deep as you think your users will tolerate. By the way, the sitemap file fully supports localization, so you can work with resource files to display navigation text in the local language, whatever that might be. The sitemap node element has 3 standard attributes. The title is required. This provides the default text that navigation controls display for the page. In other words, it's what the user is going to see within the controls as they navigate around your site. The next standard attribute is URL. Surprisingly enough, this is an optional attribute. More often than not, you'll enter a URL for each page so that the user can navigate to the page. So for example, in the sample code for this chapter, there's a node for tame animals, but there's no page that corresponds to this node. It's just used as a category or a navigation pathway to contain other navigation paths, or web pages below it. In this case, for the pets and farm animals pages. By default, nodes without URLs are represented as plain text rather than as hyperlinks in the navigation controls. Now, it's generally considered good website design practice to provide a URL for every node in the sitemap hierarchy. That way, even without expanding a list, the user can click on the node and go to a page that talks about the pages that are below it, a very common website navigation tool. But you can feel free to design the navigation to fit whatever needs you have for your website and the expectations of your users. Fortunately, the ASP.NET navigation controls are smart enough to make the node clickable if there's a URL to navigate to. And then the third standard attribute is description. It's also optional. By default, any text that you enter as a description appears in most browsers as a tooltip for pages shown in the navigation controls. So in the sample code, many of the descriptions mirror the title attribute values, but several are different. For example, one node has rabbit as its title and bunny as its description. And you'll see that the navigation controls show a tooltip of bunny for the rabbit page. You can also add any custom attributes to the 3 standard attributes. Then you can write code to retrieve and use the values. As we demonstrate a little bit later in this section, for the custom sound attribute that identifies the sound that each of the animals makes. Now, a big warning about the sitemap nodes. No 2 sitemap node elements can have the same URL. If you do accidentally include the same URL in 2 different nodes, you'll get a runtime exception when you try and run the site. So this is a pretty serious error. It's pretty easy to fake out the provider if you really need to reference the same page from multiple places within your complex navigation hierarchy. And one way is to include query strings that aren't actually used within the page, but uniquely identify the page to the navigation control. Let's start talking about the ASP.NET Site Navigation controls. This image shows the toolbox with available navigation controls within Visual Studio. We're going to talk about and see examples of each of these navigation controls. So the controls provide different ways to navigate around the site. The site navigation controls provide various ways of displaying the sitemap to the user. The sitemap path control shows users what page they are currently on and the location within the hierarchy, how it fits into the overall structure of the site. The tree view and menu controls provide hierarchical lists of pages in rather different ways. The tree view takes up more space on the page, but gives the user a better feel for the overall structure of the site. The menu control, in contrast, takes up less room, but automatically displays relevant parts of the structure as the user mouses around the control. With the menu control, the user can't quite get a full feel for the overall hierarchy and structure of the site, but it's a little bit more focused on the particular location where they currently are within the navigation hierarchy. So let's see an example of how all these work. I'll go ahead and right-click on the default page and view it in the browser. Now I have to caution you, this is a sample page. It's not going to be normal for you to use all of the different navigation controls on a single page. Usually you'll define a single way that the user can navigate around the site, and you don't have to take up a lot of extra room. But we're trying to show you how the navigation controls work in this example. Okay, so the first control is the tree view, which is located right here. Like most tree views, you can expand and collapse different nodes, and you can click on a node in order to go to that particular page. Notice that different nodes here are actually links, as shown in blue, or shown in kind of reddish purple, whatever the color is, when you have visited a site. But the Team Animals doesn't actually have a page behind it, so that is not a link that you can click on to navigate to a page. So I'll go to my favorite pet, dogs. And so notice that we go to the animal.aspx page with a query string animal equals dog. If I scroll down a bit, notice that there are buttons that I can use to navigate to different pages within this section. The kitten is the first in this section, so I don't have a button to go any further back. I can go to the right again, which displays the dog. I can go to the right again, which displays the rabbit. And then the rabbit is the last page within that group, and so I don't show a button there. That shows how you can get access to the current location within the site navigation hierarchy so that you can programmatically do different things such as disable or enable buttons. All right, so that's the tree view control. Here's the menu control. It has flyout menus the user can use to drill down lower and lower into the site. Notice that it gives no information about where the user currently is within the navigation. I can start again, I can display wild animals, I'll go to tiger cub. The third control is displayed right here. This is the breadcrumb control, or more officially known as the site map path control. This shows the current page within the site navigation hierarchy. Notice that you can use it to navigate back up the hierarchy as well. If I want to go to wild animals, I can go ahead and click on that link, and I'm back at wild animals. Notice that now wild animals is not a link because I'm already on that page and I don't need to click on anything in order to go to this page. You can see where it got its name. It's a little bit of Hansel and Gretel. As you navigate around the site, you can go to different locations and it drops a breadcrumb for each of the locations. The interesting thing about this control is that it doesn't require a data source control to link to the web sitemap. Instead, it just automatically looks for a file called web.sitemap. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in this section. One issue with the site map path control is that there's no limit to the number of links that you can display. So that means if you have a site with a deep hierarchy, that can pretty quickly play havoc with the design of the page and flow. You can imagine if you keep going further and further down in the hierarchy here, it just keeps going out further and further out. Now you can use properties of the control to limit the number of levels shown in the control. For example, the parent levels displayed property limits the depth that's displayed, cutting off links higher in the hierarchy. So that means if I do have more levels down here, I can set that property to a particular number, and it will no longer, for example, display higher levels in the hierarchy. So that's one way to keep the sitemap path control under control. Let's look at the source behind this website. I'll go ahead and open up the default.aspx page. Notice that there are no navigation controls within this page. The reason is that this website uses a master page. And I know that because it has a master page file attribute of the page directory that specifies the master page for this site. So it's good practice to put the navigation controls in the master page because then they'll be uniform across the entire site. So let's take a look at that page. So here we have the sitemap data source, the menu control, and so forth. So this defines the standard structure of the page to define the navigation system for the entire site. Now I will point out that one of the downsides of using the navigation controls is that they can potentially add a lot of bloat to the page sent to the browser. Let me go ahead and show that. I'm going to once again display the default page. And then I'll take a look at the page source. As you can see, there's a lot of things going on in this page. The menu control has a lot of information, a lot of styling, a lot of formatting information. View state is rather large. And there's a lot of scripting files that are being downloaded as part of the navigation system. All of that animation is being taken care of by JavaScript, and these are the virtual JavaScript files that are created dynamically when ASP.NET creates the page. And as you can see as we scroll down, there's a lot of bloat within this page. It's just a byproduct of implementing all of those navigation features. So just be aware of that. You just have a lot of things going on with a page when you implement rich site navigation. There's one more control that's essential for enabling navigation, the sitemap data source. So let me go to the design view here. And take a look at that particular control. Now it's important to realize that this control is not in the navigation section of the toolbox, but is in the data section. That's because it is, just like any other data source within ASP.NET, it is linking server controls to a data source, in this case, the sitemap. If we take a look at the properties of this control, you can see that there's really very few properties that are available. For example, you can change the show starting node attribute to false. And now the menu control has changed so that the home page link is no longer available. So that's one of the ways that you can configure how the navigation controls appear by changing the data that the sitemap data source control is reading. Another thing to note here is that the sitemap provider property is blank. The data source uses the one and only one provider that ships with ASP.NET, the XML data source provider. That reads that XML-based sitemap file. It just automatically uses that file, and it has to be named web.sitemap. But one of the things you can do is you can configure different named providers that use the same XML sitemap provider, but that point to different locations and names for the sitemap file. This is a great way to dynamically change the navigation features of the site. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the section. Now, one of the big advantages of using the navigation controls is that they have very rich support for formatting. You can display the various navigation controls just about any way you want to fit into an overall design for a website. In fact, the formatting features of the controls are really the most complicated things about them. Since they're just reading the content of the sitemap, you don't really have to do anything in order to get the structure into the control. So you can set format properties of the controls, or you can create custom templates for the controls to use. First thing I'm going to do is return the show starting node to true, so that we have our full home page and all the child nodes. Then I'll select the tree view control. I'll go into the Smart tag. Notice that you can do things like change the data source, refresh the schema, or edit the tree node data bindings. I'll click on the Show Lines box here, and notice that I now have a series of lines that link everything together. So that's just one of the very many ways that you can customize the appearance of the control. By the way, the tree view and menu controls don't have to be used only for navigation. You can also bind them to other hierarchical data sources by setting the data binding properties. Another nice feature is the auto format. If I click that, I have a number of predefined formats and appearances, colors and so forth. And what this does is if I select one of these, it will automatically set the properties and styles to display the tree view similar to the preview shown over in this window. I'm going to go ahead and select the MSDN, which selects a view that is similar to a tree view control that is used on Microsoft's MSDN site. Notice now that I have an overall different appearance to the tree view. Now I'll go up to the menu control, and in the Properties window, notice that there are various sets of dynamic and static properties. So there are the dynamic properties. I scroll down a little bit further, and there's a bunch of static properties. In this example website, the home node is static. That means that it's always displayed. But the other nodes are dynamic. They fly in and out based on user interactions. So you can set different formatting options for the dynamic and static nodes, and you can control the number of static levels. Let me go to the category view here. And go to the Behavior section. There's a static display level property here that is currently set to 1. The property is now set to 1, but you can set it to 2 or any other level. When you change that number, if I can get my mouse under control, to 2, now I'm going to always display 2 levels of the hierarchy. Any other levels below that will be dynamic. Go ahead and set that back to 1. I can go to the Layout section. Notice that I have an orientation property set to vertical. I can set that to horizontal. And now, when the menu is displayed, the menu items are going to fly out horizontally in a different orientation. Let's go ahead and run the page to see that. Prompts me to save my changes. And now the menu items appear below the selected item. It's just a different orientation for how the menu control operates. Here's the Site Map Path Control. I can go back into the Properties page and change the Path Separator property. The default is this angle bracket, but I could also change it to a double colon, for example, or anything else that I wanted. And now the different breadcrumbs are separated by double colons. Now I'll click on the Smart Tag arrowhead, and I can choose Edit Templates. Notice that there are a number of different templates that you can use in order to customize the appearance of this control. So for example, instead of entering a simple set of characters for the path separator, you can use the path separator template to enter any valid HTML with your own data binding expression embedded in the HTML. So I'll select the node template, and if I wanted to, I could enter, say, an image tag to load an image to display between each of the breadcrumbs. I'll go into the toolbox and link a hyperlink control into the template. And notice that the default text just says hyperlink, just the name of the control. But at runtime, I want the text to be bound to the data source and dynamically generated, displaying the description rather than the title in the site map path. So you can use an expression to bind data to the property, and you can also do it programmatically. So I'll go over to Source View and change the hyperlink control. First thing I'll do is I'll set the font italic to true. I also have to give the control a URL to navigate to. So I'll set the navigate URL property to this kind of weird binding expression. So what this is going to do is at runtime, it's going to read the value of the URL for the current navigation node and place that into the navigate URL attribute of the hyperlink control. The last thing I need to do is change the text of the control to display the description of that node. So I'll use another eval expression. So that's going to evaluate the description attribute. And I also need to add this hash here. And that completes the evaluation. All right, so let's go ahead and go back to the Solution Explorer. Take a look at the page again. Prompts me to save my documents. And this time I'll go to the rabbit and notice that within the controls, reads and displays the description and provides a link. So instead of saying rabbit, it says bunny. So you have a lot of control over how these different controls are bound to the underlying sitemap.